Hello, everyone. Um, welcome to the Impact. For those who don't know me, my name is Lisa Barrios, and I've worked in the agriculture sector my entire career. And over the last 12 years, I've worked in and with RDCs. I'm passionate about driving impact in the sector, and in my role at Impact Innovation, I work with RDCs to co-design projects and build programs in order to achieve long-term value to industry in the sector. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands we meet on today. For myself here in Coral Bay, Western Australia, it's the Bayungu people of the Yamatji language group. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I'd also like to acknowledge any First Nations people here with us today. At Impact Innovation, we are all about standard of innovation, R&D and commercialisation practice. Impact Innovation's lab series is about bringing those of us involved in innovation, R&D, research and commercialization together to dig into specific topics and learn from others in the field. Today, we are unpacking the topic of impact, specifically R&D impact. Research impact means different things to different people, and today we'll hear from a panel of speakers about what impact means to them. We will also share some of what all of you have shared when you registered for today's lab event. There's a lot to get through, so let's get into it. Firstly, I'd like to introduce our speakers. So today we have Jane O'Dwyer. She's the CEO of the Cooperative Research Australia, focused on advancing industry research collaboration in Australia and celebrating Australian success stories that make life better for all. She has previously worked in the corporate affairs at the Australian Local Government Association and Sports Medicine Australia, and has a political advisor covering trade, regional development and resources and energy. She also spent 16 years at ANU, including as Director of the North America office in Washington and Vice President for Engagement and Global Relations. Welcome, Jane. It's great to have you on today. We also have Dr. Paul Smith, who's the Senior Research and Innovation Program Manager at Wine Australia, with responsibility for co-investment of industry and Commonwealth funding into research, development and adoption activities that benefit the grape and wine community in Australia. His working style is built around collaboration, transparency, positivity and continual focus on world-class research that leads to practical solutions. He has diverse networks and a breadth of experience across research management and communication of both scientific and industry-focused knowledge. Welcome to the lab, Paul. Lastly, we have Dr. Angus Crossan, a partner at Impact Innovation. He's passionate about supporting Australian business to thrive by implementing the best innovation and commercialisation practices. Welcome to the panel. I'm sure many of you on the line are webinar pros by now, but I'd like to remind you, as we ask questions to our panelists, please use the Q&A function to submit your own questions. We may not get to all questions asked in the session, but we will certainly try. But yeah, we love seeing those come through. So please send them in the chat. So Jane, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about your role at Cooperative Research Australia and what impact means to you?
Great, thank you. And I want to start too by acknowledging the First Nations people on whose land and airways we're on today. And I'm joining you from beautiful Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. Cooperative Research Australia is an industry association. It was originally the Cooperative Research Centres Association. We changed our name in part to reflect that we have a wider community. We have as our members CRCs, universities, post-CRC entities, but we also include in our network other collaborative entities who work at that intersection between research and industry to translate research to our lives, which brings me to the impact question and what impact means to me. When we talk about impact, we often talk about economic impact, and look, we know the CRC program, we have a lot to be proud of in that space. ACEL Allen's impact assessment, most recent impact assessment of the CRC program was published earlier this year, and it estimated that CRC, so just one program that the government supports, would generate an estimated $32.5 billion worth of economic impacts by 2025, and that our GDP is estimated to increase by $5.61 for every $1 of Commonwealth funding in the CRC since 2005. And so that's a huge economic impact. But when we talk about impact, I guess we're often trying to answer the question that an old journalist friend of mine used to always say, which is, why do we care? And people care because things impact their lives. And so really at the end of the day, when we're talking about impact, we're talking about the way it affects people's lives. So how it affects our economy and the jobs and the complexity in our economy and the variety of businesses in our economy. But we're also interested in the social and environmental impacts. So for instance, what sort of impact do we have on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions? What sort of impact do we have in improved health and well-being of the population? What sort of improved protection of our endangered species? An improved economic mix for Australia. So there's many ways that we see impact, but at the end of the day, to me, what impact means is that we've managed to make the most of the extraordinary research in our research institutions and translate it into something that has effect on our day-to-day lives.
Wow. Thank you, Jay. That was fantastic. So it's a busy time of year for you as well. The Cooperative Research Australia's Collaborative Innovate Conference will kick off in Adelaide next Monday to Wednesday. So thank you for sharing some of your time with us. We know it's very, very busy. Paul, I'm going to ask you the same question now. Can you tell us about your role at Wine Australia and what impact means to you?
Yes, certainly. Thanks, Lisa. It's great to be here. So for me, I'm working in an organisation, Wine Australia. We're in DC. We've got grape growers and winemakers as our levy payers and our customers. So for us, we've got a few roles. We're a regulator. We look after marketing of Australia as a wine producing country, and then our research and innovation investment focus. So that's the section I'm working in. So I'm a senior program manager in research and innovation, generally looking over the wine production side of projects, but increasingly looking at how we can adapt our investment strategies and some of the policy positions we take on that to try and realise some of this impact, this increased impact. And thinking about it, I mean, echoing some of Jane's views there, for me, impact is the reach that research has beyond the academic realm. So how does the contribution of that research influence the economy? How does it influence society? How does it influence the environment? And a last bit, I think, which is quite relevant, is the culture. So, and I think thinking through some of the questions that we'll consider today, I think that culture piece is probably really quite significant. But for us, coming back to grassroots, it's our customers are grape growers and winemakers. They have a complex set of different business structures depending on their models and how they operate in their sector. And so really thinking deeply about how an impact might benefit a particular grape grower or winemaker, depending on whether they're small, medium, big, what their relationship in the value chain. That's really important to us.
Great, thank you. Angus, you work with CRCs, RDCs and research institutes across Australia. How would you define R&D from your perspective?
That's a great question. Happy to be here. Thank you and welcome to our guests and to everyone. It's a question really that's it's been so important for me in my career. It's really defined my career. I started out as a researcher and got pretty frustrated that a lot of the work researchers didn't actually go anywhere. And I was sort of frustrated that we do this good work and only some of it would make sort of impact. So since then, I've worked in this space, and as you mentioned, in with CRCs and in RDCs and in other vehicles. And to summarise the question, it's a big question, but to summarise it, I think it's got to have change or change the world in some way, whether it's a new product or service or an environmental outcome or empowerment of people, or it just needs to change an operating model or a business model. And that's the case, I think, for partners of CRCs. They've got their own requirements, and so the research needs to do something towards their operating model, or in an RDC case, extension and adoption, what we're really asking is for our producers and growers to change their operating model or change their business practice with new R&D. So those are the types of things that that I define as impact. So I think it echoes what the others have mentioned, but really around a change.
Thanks, Angus. So when everyone registered for today's event, we did ask you all, what does impact mean to you? It's great to hear that our speakers in our panel today really just echoed some of these themes that came across. But here's a selection of our top responses in a word cloud. As you can see, there was a lot of variation. Although when we started summarising and sorting, we determined that the top 4 responses were around adoption of R&D, generating value, true innovation, and investment effectiveness. So I'd love to get the thoughts of the panel around this. Paul, do you have any thoughts on where we got to with these themes?
Yeah, absolutely. They're a fabulous distillation of a lot of problems that we all probably think through. So it was really kind of reassuring to hear them bubble to the surface. And so the adoption side of things, we have given as a business this quite a lot of thought over the last 5 years. And my colleague Joe Hargraves, who's led the strategy on our adoption and extension program, was central to putting out an adoption and extension strategy, which is on our website if anyone wants to go and look at it. But the nuts and bolts of that is just some principles by which we approach the path to adoption, and they are centrally around designing activities in conjunction with users. So having a really customer focused perspective, but by really speaking to them. And those of us who've been to field days know that there can be some really effective ones and some really ineffective ones. So talking to grape growers quite often is best done in a shed, around a barbecue, not in a school table format, central presentation kind of model with someone at the front and a PowerPoint screen. So designing those activities in conjunction with users, I think, is really central. This idea of offering consistent messaging, so that the same messaging is going out time and time and time and time again and gets echoed. This idea of measuring impacts, that's the tricky thing. We'll probably dive into that later, but at least making some effort to really consider how would we understand if an impact has been realised, and setting in motion a way of measuring that. And quite often that's going to have to go over a reasonable period of time too. And I think that's sometimes underdone. Look, supporting multiple providers and a range of access points, given that people come at these, they live geographically dispersed, they live in different environmental areas and connectivity areas. So delivering it through webinars, podcasts, things that people can stick in their ear when they're at a tractor, centralised points where everyone can get together around field days. Thinking through a range of diversity there. A focus on outcomes. So what's the promise? Are you going to come along to this extension event? What's the promise that you're going to get before you walk away? So we're trying to make a promise that you'll be able to do X or Y or Z, or and then this idea that innovation is a loop, not a path. So you're doing something, you're learning from it, you're coming back and you're looping and so forth. So we've sort of distilled this into this escalating step of inform people, consult with people, involve people, collaborate with people, and then ultimately empower people. So they should be empowered by the end of that. So that's adoption. Value for us, I think the question is value for who? So the primary focus for us is obviously levy payers, but there's a whole value chain around them. And unless that value chain derives some value from what you're doing and what you're trying to get out, it's hard to get adoption if they aren't a part of a path to impact or delivery. So we've expanded our thinking a bit towards that, more intentionally considering obviously the primary value to the grape grower or the winemaker, but also considering, okay, well, who else is in this system and what does the value proposition look like for them? around innovation, for me, this is around realization of value from invention. So invention being, the act of creating something novel or new, but in itself, an invention doesn't necessarily create value to anyone. So what are the associated processes and systems and people and considerations we need to build around invention to then realize that value? So this is a sweeping statement, but a number of productivity commission reviews have distilled it. I mean, in Australia, we're excellent at invention, R&D, but we're really just playing a bit of catch up now at how we really effectively realize value from that, so resulting in a change of practice that results in a benefit to someone. And investment effectiveness, I mean, that's super tricky. And I think it comes back again to this monitoring and evaluation piece, the challenge, and what's the timeline of that, and what's the linearity of the connection between our actions and the change that arises from them. So quite often I get challenged by researchers to say, well, adoption's a 10 to 15 year process in agriculture. So, the implication is it's not my problem, right? It's going to happen, but it's going to happen long after I've done my research. But I think if we've seen anything from the last 3 years, we know that changes can occur very fast and adoption can change incredibly speedily. And that's often a measure of the pressure in a system. So the more pressure is in a system, the more likely it is that an adaptation is going to occur. And so the types of pressures that are building in ag currently, I think, are, approaching the level of pressure that we've seen around the COVID pandemic stuff that's happened over the last few years. So I think we can see change much faster than that if we're intentional about it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. Jane, do you have anything to add to this?
Look, I think Paul captured it so well. And I think one of the things I wanted to say there that I think is really critical in this R&D impact is there's a real role of those people, I call them the intermediaries, and I know a lot of people do, but they call them different names, but those that help that translation piece happen. And I had one of our members describe it to me really well last week, is that their skill was working with businesses who are able to identify and define a business problem. So what is the problem they're trying to solve? And then translate that into a research question. And this is one of the challenges, I think, in the adoption of R&D and generating value from them, is managing to translate between what businesses or industry or communities might identify as a problem, translating that into something that can be solved through research and through collaboration with those end users. And that's really where the impact happens. It's where the two strengths come together. And I think Paul provides some great examples of that in agriculture.
Great, thank you. Well, it's a great segue to our next topic, which aligns with where we asked all of our attendees here today to list their biggest challenges when it comes to achieving research impact. The most popular responses we received there were time, availability of funding, and culture. There was also a significant number of the audience who stated that the measurement of impact was a challenge. Now, I think you've both touched a little bit on, some figures there and some measurement of impact. Are there any comments you have on measuring of impact in your organisations and what you see in your roles?
Sure. I'm happy to
go for it, Jane.
So, look, impact's it's a perennial question about how we measure impact and on what time frame we measure it. So I was in the university sector when we went through the last impact and engagement assessment of university research. And that was a challenging process for people within the research sector. And I think part of what I observed in that process was the timelines and how we measure impact. The CRC program is kind of interesting because it's been so reviewed and studied. And I think it's not the only program in government that has been reviewed and studied, but because it's run over 30 years, there's been a lot of impact assessments and different models trying to assess that economic impact, but also those other social as environmental impacts. I think one of the challenges in measuring impact is time and time scale. We often things can move at different speeds. So at the moment, we're seeing pressure to move ahead technology, for instance, around batteries. So battery technology is moving very fast because there's massive investment. We saw it through COVID. You know, we saw RNA vaccine technology, which had been around for 30 years, suddenly accelerate into use. And we could do massive clinical trials because population of the world needed them. But there are these different timescales, and it's very difficult to measure impact in a meaningful way because of those, because government operates on shorter timescales. So they're looking for what's the return on our investment, often on electoral cycles or smaller ones. Institutions often measure them on those shorter timescales. But in fact, the biggest innovations, the biggest impact we've had have had very long timelines. And I think that's that time question and how we deal with that is one of the real challenges in measuring.
Great.
Yeah, if I can add to that, Lisa.
Yeah, please do, Paul.
Yeah, that linearity of connection between what you do now and the action you take now and something that's an outcome, it's challenging. But I think we're just trying to increase our commitment to, mid to long term commitment of monitoring that. And so we're interested in outcomes rather than outputs, so that the focus on value impact. So the outcome might be the ability to make better irrigation decisions on the basis of technology, whereas the output from one of our projects might have been, a soil moisture probe to stick in the ground and measure soil water. So overall, we're probably more interested in the former, but that's the one I think that needs a much more long-term commitment. And unfortunately, it means that often we're trying to monitor and measure things long time after the project is finished, and everyone has potentially moved on to different things. So having a persistent commitment to some of those things, I think, it's probably one of the challenges, to hold.
Great, thanks, Paul. So just going back to the impact and definitions we saw and the challenges, Angus and I discussed that, perhaps one of the biggest challenges is there may not be a consensus across the sector in terms of these definitions, and within organisations or perhaps even within project teams around what impact is. Angus, did you want to touch on this?
Yeah, I can. I think it's so important to have the definition, because if you don't have the definition, what are you measuring for? And in the context of this discussion, I think it's even harder to do because we've got multiple organisations need to pull together to get the impact or the outcome. If you're a single organisation and we if we were hypothetically working with an organisation like that, it's very simple because we can define it. We typically use the ISO standards, and they have a very clear process of defining the value from innovation. And so for that organisation, it works well, and it might be revenue, reduced cost, customer satisfaction, social output or environment, and things like that. But that's for one organisation. When both Paul and Jane have alluded to the fact that we've got multiple organisations. We've got research organisations, we've got funding organisations, we've got the intermediary and supply chain, and then of course end users and ultimate end users in terms of customers. So all of that value is different, but I think the key is alignment. It's finding the projects or working with teams that can ask those questions up and down the supply chain and look for that win-win alignment that says this is a project that's working because it's dealing with the value or the output that we want from our investment in this space, which is about how that's defined for that organisation. And because that, I just think extremely important, but not an easy thing to do.
Thank you. So Paul, you've also done some work over the past few months to overcome challenges that will enable Wine Australia to achieve greater impact. Can you talk us through this process?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have been trying to intentionally consider how we take a more direct path or a stronger organisational role, I suppose, in the translation of really great research that happens out of our investments through to use, basically, by our customers, by grape growers and winemakers. And it's required us to really intentionally consider what parties need to be involved in that, beyond ourselves and the customer that will use it, researcher. So it's also required a shift in thinking around the level of responsibility, cultural responsibility that everyone in the system might have to not just do a baton pass. It's not a relay where you're just passing a baton on to someone else and that's your bit of the problem dealt with, and then someone else is dealing with the next stage. So we're trying to build a more holistic view from as early as possible in a project. So it comes back, a lot of it in principle to a co-design type of model. It's used a lot, a term that's used a lot these days, but it really just distills down to consultation and discussion and deeply understanding a problem, and understanding that a different customer segment might see that problem a different way. So might have the same problem, and I don't know, use making sensible irrigation, informed irrigation decisions again as an example. But there might be a small grower, medium grower, and a large grower, and so their ability to engage with a set of solutions for that problem might be quite different. One might have lots of capital that they can deploy on a solution, and other might need something that's really smell of an oily rag type of model. So for us,
I think you've just gone on mute, Paul. Sorry, we've just lost you.
Yeah, thanks. That was my piece of paper here. To instill into our some of our producers, some of our R&D providers, a greater level of capability around doing that consultation. And so this cultural piece, I think, is enormous. And I was a scientist. I was never trained in many of these consultation type processes. And so I think programs like CSIRO On, which is a capability building program that I was exposed to 4 or 5 years ago, and fundamentally sort of educated me that there was a process that could be followed to determine a path to why someone would want to use it, building a value proposition for something and communicating that. So building a more holistic awareness of the tools available for doing that, and that, yes, there's a level of creativity and non-linearity in it, but actually there can be really structured processes that can be followed. But it may often need either quite a dynamic individual prepared to go outside their comfort zone, or a small group of people with a diverse set of skills amongst them working collectively, to do that transition. And for us, it's particularly that so-called valley of death between something being proven in a lab or in principle, so what we might call the technological readiness level of kind of 3 on the 9-point scale. But as you move through 4 and 5 and 6, and you move into prototyping and field testing and so on, you want to have some partners with you that could take it out the other end, deliver it as a product or a service. And it's a bit late in the piece to come to them with a prototype and say, here it is, do you want it? If they said, well, I might have if I'd been involved a year ago and designed it this way.
So it's about going back to what Jane said, I think earlier, it's about building that team, right? And that set of skill sets that, you can collaborate with along the journey or along the time period of the project, rather than just, like you said, passing the buck. So
definitely, that capability, broadening of capability around this.
Yep, fantastic, thank you. And Jane, rather than focusing on the challenges, I guess we've looked at that a little bit there. Is there a really impactful case study you could share with us in your area of expertise?
Sure, there's so many, and lots of people will know ones like Cochlear, which came out of the hearing CRC. But I'm going to share one that answers the question that my journalist friend would always say, why do we care? And we care because it affects us all, or affects a lot of us. So I'm sure there are a lot of people on this webinar today who wear contact lenses and who benefit from wearing soft contact lenses that you can wear for long periods of time. You might not be aware that's an Australian development, an Australian invention that came out of the CRC program. So silicon hydrogel contact lenses, which were launched as day and night lenses way back at the end of the 90s, are a great success story, but also a really great illustrative example of the process of and the time it takes for impact. So we know now, if we talk about, say, I mean, the health impact is obvious. You can wear contact lenses that don't hurt your eyes, and you can wear them for long periods of time. You don't have to change them constantly. That was a significant impact for people. There are 10 million contact lenses produced every year, and about 50% of them are these particular ones. The way they came about was they were developed by the Cooperative Research Centre for Eye Research and Technology, which was one of the early CRCs. And it was a fairly long process, and it involved teams of more than 80 people collaborating to solve a problem that was identified around the overnight swelling you get in your eyes if you've got that. To try and prevent that, you need oxygen to touch your eyes. So this team, led by Brian Holden, for whom the post-CRC entity for that CRC, the Brian Holden Vision Institute, is named, worked on this problem, and it was a large multidisciplinary, multinational collaboration. There were people from biomedical engineers, biologists, polymer chemists, clinical scientists, materials scientists. This was a massive study. They did this before we had Zoom, so what we're taking for granted now did not exist. So they were trying to collaborate, 80 to 90 people working across locations and time zones to try and solve this problem. And it took a long time. There were lots of problems with the solutions that they came up with. They often were too thick, or they would let in too much oxygen or not enough oxygen. But eventually, after significant work and human trials, it the final product was developed, and it received FDA approval in the United States in 1999. So that approval in the US was really important for it becoming a global success story. But it's a real example of collaborative research, of working across disciplines with industry on a problem that affects lots of people, eventually becoming a commercial success story and a health and wellbeing success story, so a social impact success story. But the thing that really sticks out to me about this is it's a long collaboration, it's a long time frame. It really needed that Commonwealth investment to leverage industry and research support. It needed to be across multiple research organisations and across multiple business partners to work. So it really to generate that final value required some investment along the way, and long commitment, and an ability to collaborate across very, very different areas. And so now I hope when any of you go to take out your contact lenses, you think, oh, Australia played a really important role in that. And it's definitely generated value and impact.
Jane, can I throw in a quick follow-up query there? I was interested in, and I'm not sure if you know the detail, but how soon did they get sort of the, if you like, the commercial, the supply chain people involved in that project?
So that's a really good question. So industry were involved from the beginning. That's the, experience in the CRC program. Yeah. If I have a look at my notes here, so the initial one, they had commercial partners, so would have been in the late 90s. It looks like it took probably 5-10 years, but then it went on to further development, so further updates. It looks from this the successor organisation, the Vision CRC and the Brian Holden Vision Institute, have then developed multiple commercial outcomes. So I'm assuming there's been commercial partners all the way along there.
Yeah.
So, sorry, I have that right.
Yeah, no, all good. I was just sort of reflecting through the story and even picking up on the cultural change that Paul mentioned. Is it's really easy to invest in the research, but and it's great research. Yet we often in Australia don't invest as much in the development of the commercial or the impact or the deployment of the research. And so when the research investment finishes, it's like there's no resource or no one around to take it further. And it sounds like that in that case that it was covered through that partnership. So that's what it made me think of.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right there. I think that's, I mean, we're seeing some movement in government around trying to close some of those gaps. We've seen previous attempts as well. But it is a really interesting question, because if we take the role that these entities that operate between research institutions and industry, they're often moving it along the path, and there are commercial success stories out of them, but they're not always the commercialisation vehicle for it. And sustaining that growth, and particularly for something that has global potential like this, to get it across that line, to get the support to get it through, particularly in medical and health products, to get it through approvals and clinical trials that allow them to be used, that's a very fragile time for them. And I think that's where that question of support through government is really important.
And Jane, we've just had a question from the audience. Does the Brian Holden Vision Institute receive royalties from the contact lenses, or do others receive royalties? Are you aware?
That's a very good question. I don't know. I think that the Brian Holden, I think that's how it operates, is that it receives royalties, or it had received significant royalties, certainly in the past. So yes, but sorry, okay. I can't. I'd have to check.
No problem. Thank you. Well, we can follow that up if need be, and send the list of answers out to our audience. It really touches then on a question that we had throughout the registration process, and Paul, feel free to also touch on this if you can. But how do you work with research and development providers to achieve greater impact through what you discussed before in the case studies that you identified? What's the thing that really just drives that impact for you at Wine Australia?
Yeah, I was reflecting on that continuity piece. You talk about getting over the line, not to labour the analogy of the relay race, but it's because there's periods where you've got an R&D organisation and they're running the baton themselves, but there's these periods, I think, where you've got to have several people all holding the baton at once, and they're all running along for a period, and they pass it on to perhaps another, singular entity or individual body. So I think what we're trying to do is trying to find ways to engineer that group that are all holding the baton at those really sensitive periods that Jane just referenced, that where if you drop it, then the race is over. So we are trying to work on the inclusion of parties around the baton at that point in the race, and that's requiring some increased level of engagement, diversification of stakeholder management. That brings complexity with it, but we're really seeing a lot of success from that, a lot of concrete guidance and crystallization of focus and where to go from that, because we're getting some really rich insights. Quite often can understand the broad problem, but we get much deeper and nuanced insights into the particular natures of the problem, or what a particular customer might need. So I think it's that depth of insight that you get when you get multiple people around the table, and they're all pitching in and putting their perspectives on. And I've seen now several of these sort of aha moments where people say, "Oh, okay, I thought the problem was this, but actually the problem's that, and it's for that particular customer there."
Just refining that solution then down to that user. Yep. Great. Another question that we had specifically around the government, how can government best support researchers and industry to commercialise their ideas or turn them into real world solutions? Who'd like to have a go at that? Jane, feel free.
It's one of my favourite topics. Well, look, programs like the RDCs, like the CRCs, are really important in that space, and they're proven. We've had study after study after study which tells us this helps this happen. And why does it help it happen? It does it through a couple of ways. Firstly, it unlocks private sector R&D investment. So research institutions alone can't commercialise the outcomes of their research, but they also don't necessarily have the experience, skills, or appropriate information or drivers to identify what the business problem is that they're trying to solve. They're able to identify a research problem, but business problems are those occurring in business. We don't have a huge culture of R&D investment by the private sector in Australia. So these programs are critical to help change that culture. They help bring industry into contact with research and help them to see R&D and accessing research and working with researchers as ways not just of solving business problems that they can see, but potentially as seeing R&D and the creation of new products, processes, services as ways of growing and transforming their business. So that's a really critical and important element of what government does. So it's about unlocking that investment by providing some leverage. So that's really critical. The second thing is it goes to, sorry, and I've just lost my train of thought on what my second one was. So the unlocking part, the second one I think is probably in order to build that greater degree of economic complexity in Australia and to maintain the workforce that we're after to support researchers, we do need government to expand that funding. It is limited by OECD levels. We're not investing as significantly as competitor countries. And the reality for that is we're in a global competition for talent. We want our own population to see valuable careers in R&D, but we also need to be able to attract the best talent from around the world. And if we don't make that investment in helping research translate to social, economic, environmental benefits, then we lose out in that race and we miss the opportunities that we potentially have. We have such high performing research institutions in Australia. Every global ranking of our universities tells us that. So the lack of R&D investment by industry in Australia is something that that really needs to be addressed, and government plays a role there in unlocking that by bringing them into setups like CRCs, where what they provide is a well understood, well studied framework for industry and researchers to be able to work together to bring their strengths to the table and to play to their strengths for an outcome that has impact.
Great, thank you. Paul, did you want to add to Jane's comment?
I absolutely reinforce what she says there, and those programs. I've got a couple of points there I'd probably make, which is, I think some really deep thought about the incentive and reward systems that operate in our research institutions. And I guess in some ways that the access to funding through CRC programs or equivalent kinds of programs is an element of that incentive and reward system. But the hunt for funding is what drives many academics and researchers, and that continued ability to secure funding. So that's how they're rewarded. Also, they're rewarded by papers and they're rewarded by a number of grants and so forth they get. So if we can put incentivized models that, okay, yes, I've got some grant funding now, but it now requires me to operate in this new, different way, with a greater industry connection and capability. But I think that brings me to my second point, which is that they then need capability development. I mean, fundamentally need training and education and advice and support around how to operate in this way, because it's not something that is foundationally taught generally, particularly not in science, but I'd suggest not generally in research. And so again, I come back to an example of the CSIRO ON program, which very intentionally is trying to increase awareness around and capability associated with those skills. But I think we need it on a scale that's multiples of what we're seeing in the Australian community at the moment. The third thing, I don't know how you do this, is instilling a sense of responsibility around your engagement, and you have a sense of, if you can find a way to instill a sense of responsibility to be a part of that race to the end, and do whatever you can to hold on to that baton and get the baton across to someone else who can carry it on further.
Great, thank you. I think you've just touched on the next question that came through also is around how important is having adoption and extension skill sets built into research projects. You just mentioned a few points there. Did you want to add anything to how important or what the weighting is around those skills and in a project?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, for us, it comes, yes. So I think intentionally considering that as early as possible in a project is something that's incredibly important and that we're advocating for. And second thing is that extension goes beyond awareness raising. It's not a matter of just doing some informing. Informing is really actually only the first step. So raising someone's awareness that a piece of knowledge exists or a thing exists is actually one of about 5 steps towards them being empowered to just action, to be able to action that. And so that stage in between of, okay, now they're aware of this piece of knowledge or whatever, but we've now got to go into a phase of consulting with them, involving them, collaborating with them, so that ultimately they end up empowered to act on that in their own right. And I think I've seen early on in my career that there was perhaps in some circles the sense that awareness raising was sufficient, and then it was someone else's responsibility to work out how to go and action that. I think our view now is that we're getting far more intentionally involved in the intermediate periods that lead to ultimate empowerment.
Great, thank you. And I've got one big question for the panel. So what do you view as critical for impact for the long term? Jane, did you want to touch on that first?
That's a very big question. What is critical for impact for the long term? I suppose that question could be taken many ways. So what do researchers need to do? What does government need to do? What does the industry need to do? Or how do we measure it? So I'll have a go at that one. So what's critical from a researcher point of view is doing really excellent research is critical for impact. I mean, I sometimes worry that in the discussion about the translation of research, we distract from the role that Australia's researchers play and how important it is that we celebrate and reward people for doing excellent research, because you can't translate and you can't create impact if we don't have the excellent research. So I do worry that sometimes in this conversation we're asking or creating a sort of climate that says to researchers, well, it's great that you do good research, but you also need to commercialize this, and we also need to see you be an entrepreneur or that. That's not necessarily right for everybody. But what is clear is that our research capacity is really good. So first of all, we need to support research and support it with enough funding for it to do well. We need to support those entities that support translation of research and bring industry in and help researchers and industry understand each other's capacity, problems, and to work together for potential solutions and design solutions together. I think that's where that funding of these entities that sit in the middle, like RDCs, CRCs, Trailblazers, etc., is really critical, because that's what unlocks the community's engagement and private sector engagement. The third thing is around how we measure it in the long. So we need to take long time views when we're measuring it. I think too often I hear, oh, you know, we haven't seen an outcome from this CRC yet. And you think, well, it's still operating. It's potentially going to create something that's really significantly changing. It'll be having some impact now, but we need to look at this as, what did it do 5 years later, 10 years later? And because of the way government funds, we often don't look at those long time horizons. So we do need to look at those and celebrate them. We're all operating off Wi-Fi today, I'm pretty sure. That did not happen in a 5-year funding cycle, and someone couldn't tick it off in a grant that they did. So we need to do those things. I think the other thing too around impact is we do need to look at the incentives. I agree with Paul there. What are the incentives and supports we provide to researchers, but also to industry to engage with research? We need to make sure we've got the right incentives and that we create more porous boundaries between research and industry. We have a fairly traditional system in Australia where it's quite hard to go from working in a university and pursuing a research career out into industry and then come back, because they've all got different incentives, different measures of success. So I think we really do need to keep interrogating that and look at better ways of measuring people's contribution and impact.
Lisa, I might jump in there if I may. Following that, one of the things we focus on and aligns very strongly with what you're saying, Jane, is who's the next investor of this research. And that can apply through the whole, you know, stage gate or process, if you like. Early stage research and R&D, you know, it might require some successive investments from a CRC or an RDC, but then at some stage a supply chain partner needs to get involved. So what information do they need to see in order to make that investment decision? Or if it's, you know, about an end user change of practice, what data do they need to see in order to, you know, buy the R&D or the change of practice? And thinking of that, and I think for the future, building that question into current investment is critical, because then at the end of that investment, you have the information that people need to make decisions about future investment. So that's my take on that question.
Thanks, Angus. Paul, did you want to finish us off with your view on what's critical?
Sure. I mean, I agree with both of those. They are really eloquent summaries of what we're facing. For me, I think the experience I've had so far has been that training and capability piece of human capital in the system, wherever it is, that has the ability and understanding to bridge these worlds and facilitate that period where you're running the baton all together before it gets passed on to someone else who might then do a chunk of work themselves, and then they might need then, you know, some more people around to take it further. But those are tenuous, messy, complex human interactive systems, and so to have capabilities and frameworks and processes in there that empower people, I think is really important. And then that incentivization piece. I mean, you know, how's a market? How are we sending market signals into the system that this is the kind of thing that we want to happen? And the CRC program is a market signal, right? You know, the market is coin operated. So if you can make sure that the market is signaling that you get rewarded if you can follow this path, then, you know, I think we'll see that shift towards that outcome. But people still won't engage necessarily if they don't feel like they've got the capability to learn adapt, you know, to that requirement. Yeah. Fantastic.
Thank you. And just moving across to all of you for any final thoughts, reflections, advice, one-liners. Jane, do you want to start us off?
Look, research matters. good research matters. So I think that's the fundamental basis upon which we can create impact. But all those supports that we build in the system to help translate that research, that's really important. And I see that as a big part of my job, is advocating for that and advocating for investment that supports us to unlock that brilliant research that we have in Australia.
Thanks, Jane. Paul?
Yeah, emphasising what Jane said earlier, this is not an either or binary kind of situation. You don't either have research excellence or have this translation piece. They need to go together, and because we might be having an increased focus currently on the conversation around this translation piece, does not equate to a diminished value of that first stage. And some of the resistance I often see is that, well, this is going to result in a diminished focus on research excellence, but we shouldn't be, the system should be trying absolutely to accommodate that, but also find paths to very intentionally incentivize the translation of it as well. So it's, the two are quite mutually complementary, I think. And the process of doing that translation can so often spin up really difficult, challenging, fascinating, fundamental questions that need to be addressed using science. And Jane covered some of those with the polymer side of the contact lenses. I'm sure there were endless loops back into foundational research that process instigated. And so it is actually a process that expands our capacity to have really well-funded and supported foundational research system.
Great, thanks, Paul. And Angus, did you want to leave us with your final words of wisdom?
Only that it's such a huge topic and so important for all the players, right? If we don't get impact, then, as I mentioned before, the researchers don't see that, or, the contribution is not made, and we just lose that value. And really, it's just about that alignment. Yeah, nothing more than that. I think it's been covered as best it can be in 50 odd minutes. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And that's all we have time for today, everyone. Thank you so much, Jane, Paul, and Angus, for taking the time to share with us today. Something we always do at our lab events is donate $100 on behalf of each speaker to a charity of their choice. And as a token of our appreciation for taking part today, Jane, who would you like to donate to today?
Well, in the spirit of supporting research as really critical for affecting people's lives, I nominate the Black Dog Institute, which supports research into mental health.
Thank you, Jane. That's fantastic. And Paul?
I'm going to nominate a bit of a left field one that's just close to my heart, which is the Sunshine Children's Home in Paul. So many years ago, travelled through that part of the world, and yeah, it's foundationally important that some of these people out in the world get the support they need to build a life that they can really thrive in. So
and then they might be some of our research experts and R&D guys in the future coming into our industry, right? So
absolutely.
Exactly. So we've also set up a quick poll to see what more you would like from impact innovation and how we can further unpack R&D. We're going to launch that now. So please take a minute to fill it out if you can. We've also had so much interest in today's lab event, and we've made the decision to stay with the topic for at least one more session. So stay tuned for more details on that soon. And feel free to send us an email, let us know what you would like to talk about more from this topic, and we'll do our best to expand on that further, because it is just huge, and we can go into any avenue we would like to follow on for both CRCs and R&D, for impact and other areas. If you'd like to talk to one of the impact innovation team about anything innovation, R&D, commercialization, please also drop us a line. Our details are on the screen. So we will also be at next week's Collaborate Innovate Cooperative Research Association Conference. It's a mouthful, Jane. Thank you for that. So come and see us there. Impact Innovation has come on as a sponsor this year, and we'll be providing the CRC community with barista coffee for the full 3 days. So Angus will be there in the The team looking after CRCs will also be there to have a chat about everything we've discussed today. Feel free to touch base with them. Otherwise, we'll send through a survey. So please take a few minutes to fill it out so we can make these sessions the best they can be for you. We'd love to continue these discussions on. And thanks again to our wonderful speakers and the IIG team for their time today. We hope to see you all at the next lab event. Have a great day. Thanks, guys.